Bom dia, sejam todos muito bem-vindos à aula inaugural do grupo Ciência em Circulação do Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Unifesp. Eu tenho o enorme prazer de receber o professor Simone Turchetti, que será melhor apresentado pela Isabela. Eu gostaria de dizer que todas as perguntas podem ser colocadas no chat e, ao final da apresentação do professor, nós vamos passar para ele responder. Welcome everyone to another seminar from the Science in Circulation group. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Simone Turchetti for the inaugural lecture of this group. So I wanted to thank Isabela Bonaventura and Helena Tacola for the organization of all this. Thank you very much, Professor Simone, and I will pass the word to Isabela to present us, to better present us to the professor. So, Isabela, please.
Oh, thank you, Anna. So, good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone, to your opening lecture of SciCi, Science in Circulation group. And for our opening lecture, we are delighted to receive Professor Simone Turchetti. Welcome, Professor Simone, and really thank you for accepting joining us today for this lecture that I'm sure will be so interesting for all of us. And I would like also to thank Anna to offer us the space and to be on board of those adventures with me. And also thank Helena for being here with us, giving us all the support necessary. So
and Michelle.
Michelle. Yeah. Michelle. For sure, Michelle.
Yes. It's the technician who helped.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Michelle. And I will present Professor Simone briefly in English and then in Portuguese, and then I will give him the floor for the lecture that we are looking forward. So, Professor Simone Turchetti is chair in the Center of History of Science, Technology and Medicine of the University of Manchester. Currently, he is the president of the European Society for the History of Science and also the former president of the Commission on Science, Technology and Diplomacy. That commission organizes several meetings worldwide, one of them held in São Paulo in 2023, when I met Professor Simone first time. And Professor Simone researches and teaches on the history of science in the 20th century, focusing his studies on nuclear energy, weapons, impacts of scientific collaboration and on international relations, science diplomacy as well. He is the principal investigator in the European Research Council project named Negotiating World Data, a Science Diplomacy Study. This theme will be the topic of our today's lecture and also was worked by Professor Simone in a paper he sent to us, and we will put for the audience on the chat briefly. This topic will also be addressed in July's meeting of European Society of History of Science, held in Edinburgh next July, in a symposium organized with Sarah Bassanelli, in which I'll be the pleasure to be presenting a little piece of my research there. So, Professor Simone, I will now introduce you in Portuguese, and then I will give you the word. Eu gostaria de dizer bom dia e boa tarde para todos e todas que nos assistem, dar as boas-vindas para essa palestra de abertura do grupo SciCi, Ciência em Circulação, e apresentar brevemente o professor Simone. O professor Simone Turchetti, ele é professor do Centro de História da Ciência, Tecnologia e Medicina da Universidade de Manchester. Atualmente, ele é o presidente da Sociedade Europeia de História da Ciência e foi o presidente da Comissão de Ciência, Tecnologia e Diplomacia, né? Comissão essa que faz eventos ao redor de todo o mundo, um deles feito em São Paulo, onde eu pude conhecer o professor Simone. O professor Simone também pesquisa e estuda história da ciência no século XX, com foco em energia nuclear, questão das armas, impacto das colaborações científicas nas relações internacionais e diplomacia científica, que é o grande foco dos seus trabalhos, inclusive de um projeto que ele coordena junto à Comissão de Pesquisa Europeia, e esse projeto se intitula Negociando Dados ao longo do mundo, ao redor do mundo, um estudo de ciência e diplomacia. Esse tópico é o tópico de um artigo que nós vamos disponibilizar, o link é um open access, então vocês podem se sentir à vontade para baixar, ler, enfim. Também é um tema de um simpósio que o professor Simone está organizando com a colega Sara Bassanelli no encontro de Edimburgo, da Sociedade Europeia de História da Ciência, que eu vou ter o prazer de estar lá com eles. E, enfim, esse tema é difundido em diversos trabalhos do professor Simone. E agora eu vou passar a palavra para ele. So, Professor Simone, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Great. Actually, let me start by thanking you and Anna for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, obviously, to be with you to just share some ideas. Importantly, some of these ideas have come up in collaboration with colleagues in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, actually. So it is even more important for me to kind of, continue that conversation with you. Obviously, I mean, I don't think I need to your audience to remind what data are. They are considered fundamentally the kind of bricks that build the scientific enterprise, whether we think of data as numerical or not numerical, whether we think of them as sets of collections of information, of facts regarding scientific observations, deriving from scientific observations and experiments. There's obviously plenty of historical documentation available on data and how data have shaped the development and the history of the modern sciences. Obviously, to talk of data is to talk of an incredibly vast number of issues. For instance, issues that have to do with standardization of data and how data have over time become the subject of international coordination between scientists who have actually contributed towards making them available in standardized forms. More recently, obviously, we've been far more concerned with numerical expansion and increasing complexity of the production, collection, and storage activities connected with data. It's something that we've actually related to using the moniker of big data, obviously also making inferences and allegations about how data can have predictive and heuristic functions in the modern and especially the contemporary sciences. I should probably briefly recall that there's also a vast stream of literature in our field, in the history of science and technology, which has started a thorough investigation on data and how data can be framed historically, starting, for instance, with the work of Sabina Leonelli and Niccolo Tempini, an edited collection that I think has been informative, especially of the kind of practices that scientists use in and adopt in the context of data production. I think Sabina Leonelli has also been Sabina Leonelli's work has been particularly important also in exploring how even the notion of data as bricks as kind of basic structures behind the sciences is a kind of oversimplification. And we need perhaps to think more carefully about data as complex historical, sociological, and philosophical objects. Bruno Strasser has also provided important contributions to this debate, looking in particular at data in the context of the experimental life sciences, and making interesting also inferences about, for instance, about how we can think of data in a sense as, and data production, data collection, data compilation, as something that brings forward in the contemporary era something that was instead more distinctive, for instance, of the ways in which a museum would actually put together collections. I think Elena Aronova is probably the historian that has brought this kind of considerations forward in time, thinking in particular about the Cold War period and, for instance, the creation of large-scale data centers, for instance, the World Data Centers, something that I'll be discussing in this presentation as well. Chris Wiggins and Matthew Jones have actually explored how, yes, of course, data are a central feature of the scientific enterprise, but actually, if we look back at their origins, perhaps they were born in an environment, in a context that was not necessarily scientific in the sense of trying to investigate natural phenomena, but rather in the organization of society, of the state. Importantly, they say something quite remarkable, I think, that, for instance, one of the disciplines really that was born together with data, statistics, was essentially born as a way to bring together knowledge of the state, statistics, state and its resources. I think is something particularly quirky and interesting to think about when we think about data, because it takes us out of the scientific enterprise proper. However, and this is where perhaps as individual researcher, but also as a PI on the project New World Data, I think one thing that needs to be stressed is that so far this investigation on data has covered a wide range of issues, but never covered enough, I think, the ways in which scientists have and policymakers and diplomats have come together to start to internationally coordinate the compilation, provision, standardization of data, data processing, with a view to actually start to put together data sets that could serve more than one international community, is what in the title of this presentation and more generally in my work, we discuss as data diplomacy. Now, the exploration of data diplomacy is something that has been at the center of the investigations of New World Data. You might have seen our website already. If you haven't, I have a very short slide here that gives you a bit of an overview of what New World Data is about and who's involved in it. It's a European Research Council project started in January 2022. It will end in December 2026. It was connected to an advanced grant awarded to me, a very prestigious award here in Europe. Its justification was exactly that while science relies today on global structures to exchange data, their origins, development, and historical trajectory is by and large still unknown. So in a sense, our effort over the last 5 years has been exactly to map, to chart the historical development of data, looking at the relevant archival documents, carrying out also some scientometric, quantitative investigation about the distribution of data sets, data centers around the world, looking in particular at the trajectory of non-governmental and governmental and intergovernmental transnational organizations, such as, for instance, the International Council of Scientific Union, UNESCO, the role that Western and Eastern blocs played in the organization, the coordination of data in the Cold War context, the role of Global North and Global South countries, and most importantly, as you can see from that slide, the efforts has been an effort that, while was sponsored through the European Research Council, it actually involved research groups that were based in Europe, in China, and Brazil, with the ambition of promoting a pluralistic understanding of these transitions. And so I would say that this is ultimately a large collective effort. And while, I'm going to offer you a bit of a narrative deriving from this effort, please take into account that this is just one of several narratives emerging from this project, which really has covered the history of data diplomacy in fields as diverse as atomic energy research, conservation, standardization, oceanography, and more. Obviously, the details of what we've done is on our website, so please have a look if you wish. Now, that said, and I hope I gave you a bit of an overview of what New World Data is about, our collective study shows that, in a sense, the core argument that we've tried to put together is that we should see data diplomacy as something of concern, not simply to the scientific community, but of broader significance from the political, global, and social perspective. This is especially because we show in the project that actually data diplomacy has played a role in setting countries apart in terms of scientific and technological development, and in particular shaping conspicuous asymmetries in the level of participation to data diplomacy, governance, and distribution of data sets. While often labeled as international, data diplomacy continued to be the premise of a few countries, while excluding most of the others, and hence shaping an unbalanced governance regime that represents today a challenging historical legacy, and in turn, something that obviously needs to be focused on also in moving forward in terms of developing policies that, in a sense, try to address these historical asymmetries. Now, if we look at the next slide, you'll see that, in a sense, one area of this investigation has been looking at what we can call a constellation of international organizations that since the 1930s to now have been at the center of this kind of data diplomacy game that have been describing to you. As you look at that timeline, you can see that actually the core of activities is in the 1950s. This is because essentially it's in the 1950s that we start to see the growth of data diplomacy, if you want, complex, international, global, where a number of organizations start to essentially ask to coordinate data sets. I'll briefly recall their history, but before we do that, I would like you to focus on the left side of your screen, where you have a number of logos and symbols and organizations, which actually represent, if you want, what we could call the prehistory of data diplomacy. Why the prehistory? Because ultimately, it seems to me that when we talk of data, we can actually start to see the first efforts to coordinate internationally before the Second World War, in the context that we could define of the empires and of imperial science. So let me just take you back to that context briefly, just to remind that, for instance, by the end of World War I, we have the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. The world is changing. Things are transitioning towards something new and by and large unknown to many. There's an important economic recession hitting most of the world by 1919. There's the Spanish flu, the first significant global pandemic in 1918. It's a time, obviously, of change. It's a time when the empires are struggling to retain a global order similar to what it was before. We have the organization of new, for instance, intergovernmental organizations such as the League of Nations. Historiography on the League of Nations suggests that ultimately this is the time when the League attempted fundamentally to coordinate the empires together to prevent their further decline. So it is in this context, I think, that we start to see the first forms of data coordination, for instance, within the data, within the League of Nations, where an important international hydrographic bureau was put together from 1921, and with the, for instance, the purpose of setting up the first, the most comprehensive world bathymetric chart to be made available at the time, which was ultimately a prominent data collection bureau. Bureau is a popular name at this point in time to identify what are fundamentally data collecting organizations. You have the International Hydrographic Bureau. You can see more there written in that timeline. The Bureau, the longitude, the Bureau Gravimetric International. And so this is a time when this is a name identifying data collecting organizations and exercises. We'll go back to this map, but I want to, for the moment, just remove it to say that it is in this context that we start to see fundamentally the first kind of organization of data collecting groups under the aegis, or especially of an intergovernmental scientific organization called the International Research Council and its scientific union, which has oversight over the scientific unions. And it is in this context that we start to see a network of scientific bureaus, particularly interested in terrestrial data associated with terrestrial phenomena in astronomy, geophysics, geodesy. For instance, in 1886, we start to have the Latitude Bureau set up in Potsdam. 1895, that on polar motion in Japan. 1919, in Paris on time. 1928, on solar activity in Zurich. And then eventually also on geomagnetism, mean sea level, and more terrestrial phenomena useful, in particular to the advancement of sciences. But I mean, thinking back at what I was saying earlier about the empires, the sciences are playing an important role in this imperial context, as in providing the data that are then needed to coordinate and connect better navigation, international commerce. So we can see science coming in at the time of decline for the empires and using data collections, data compiling as a way to counter that decline by pushing forward the process of coordination in navigation, international commerce. And it's not just that, it's also, for instance, in industry, in chemistry, in physics, through, for instance, the activities of, we can put the slide back, the United States National Bureau of Standards. This is a national and not an international bureau. However, it's a national bureau that the United States established in 1901, and that by 1924 start to actually coordinate its activities with the International Research Council, the organism that I mentioned earlier, in compiling something very important called the International Critical Tables of Numerical Data. These are compilations of physical and chemical, numerical data that have been put together as standardized data to be utilized by scientists and engineers employed in the industry, in particular chemists and physicists. They comprise, for instance, a range and a number of, for instance, organic compounds with their physical thermodynamic properties, also with the various classes of hydrocarbons that are being used in the industry. In a sense, is a way to facilitate the industrial process by feeding the industrial process with all these data. And I see the International Research Council reliance on these national bureaus tell us, therefore, a great deal about the importance of these new collections of data to bring forward the sciences at the time of change for the empires, and where the sciences start to play a new role for the empires. And obviously, this is also a time, if you want, given that the International Research Council was reliant upon what the United States Bureau would do, of change in terms of the United States becoming a far more prominent national nation in the spectrum of countries that have an advanced, developed, leading scientific complex in its own national sphere, but obviously informing also international activities. Now, you know, and I shouldn't really add anything, that everything changes after the Second World War, which obviously proved disruptive of this coordination regime as much as of anything else relating to the empires. We come out from the Second World War in a new world where much of the colonies are obviously starting an important transition towards independence, also comprising struggles. It is in this context that we have the transition also of some of the organization born in before the Second World War into new organization. For instance, League of Nations become the United Nations Educational at the United Nations, and within it, the creation of an educational, cultural, and scientific organizations responsible also for sponsoring scientific programs, some of which have to do with data. In 1931, the International Research Council had been renamed as International Council of Scientific Unions. You can see at the top of that timeline. And from then onwards, essentially attempted to reconstruct a connection within the scientific community, but only from the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, could thrive. It is in this kind of international context, post-colonial, where empires are no longer in existence as they were before, where those new countries struggle for independence, that we start to see essentially coordination through data management becoming a prominent issue. First of all, for instance, through the creation now of a new body that brings together what existed from before in the prehistory, if you want, of data diplomacy, the so-called Federation of Astronomical and Geophysical Services. This was UNESCO-sponsored, but also placed under ICSU, with the mission of fundamentally bringing together the 15 international data bureaus that existed from the beginning of the century and take the coordinated activities forward for the remaining years. But this is the time when we have the two, I think, most important example of the data diplomacy that I mentioned, namely, first of all, the creation of the so-called World Data Centers system. This is a coordinated system of data centers serving ideally each discipline in the earth sciences with a data center. And it was the product of one of the major ICSU programs developed in the early during the 1950s. They used to say the International Geophysical Year. The International Geophysical Year lasted from July 1957 to December 1958. Its history has been reconstructed in many different pieces of work, also historical. I've actually contributed a paper recently to ICES with the history of the world data centers and the IGY. What is interesting in relation to this is, however, that the world data centers really pioneered data diplomacy in the sense that they were the first coordinated sets of data centers set up internationally, which aim to serve the scientific disciplines in comprehensive and extensive ways, as a result of that big data gathering exercise that had been the International Geophysical Year. However, what I actually aim to show with my research is exactly that while we can see the IGY and the World Data Centers as these pioneering events, also propagandized as an effort for the world to know itself, as said by the Prince of Edinburgh when the Duke of Edinburgh when the IGY was put together. It actually was a kind of organization, the WDC, the World Data Centers, which actually for the first time uncovered the asymmetries that I mentioned are distinctive of the organization of data diplomacy internationally. So let me show you this graph that shows you how the world data centers were organized. They were organized in three types, A, B, and C. Of these three types, A would entirely be based in the United States, B would be based entirely in the Soviet Union, C, of which you see there only a section, would be based either in Western Europe and Japan. So you start to see that the actual geographical distribution of the centers was, on the one hand, obviously aligned with the principles of the Cold War and the leading role that some Cold War powers had during the Cold War, but more generally, actually attended to accumulate data sets in a few countries while excluding the rest of the countries from that accumulation process, making it more difficult for these countries to access the data, obviously increasing the geographical distance between the data and those that could put them to fruition. And this kind of system was also criticized, for instance, by some of the scientists participating to the IGY organizing meetings, particularly those from India, from Egypt, that actually started to see this as a way not really to bring the world together, to unite the world in the effort to collect data, but rather set the developed world apart from the developing world in terms of getting the data also extracted from the developing world and transferring them into the data centers of the developed world. So that's something that obviously start to display asymmetries in the compilation, management, access to data, and it's in a sense something for which the IGY World Data Centers were pioneering, not just in setting coordination measures in the development of data centers, but also in setting those asymmetries that I mentioned earlier. Interesting, 66 national committees participated in the IGY. And if you think that the number of countries that had data centers compared to the 66 that participated, you can already start to see an important imbalance there. Now, moving forward, the WDCs obviously continue to thrive for a number of years, continue to be an infrastructure of data on terrestrial phenomena, serving scientists from all over the world, but in serving those scientists, really serving more scientists, some scientists more than others, because obviously of proximity to the data centers, to the data facilities, to the data collected. But I also wanted to tell you a little bit more about the other. If you remember, the other thread was the United States National Standard Bureau serving this International Research Council through the production of the international critical tables of numerical data in physics and chemistry, which is what, if you see, again, my timeline, what eventually resulted in the creation of CODATA. CODATA, the Committee on Data in Science and Technology, is something that actually was being thought of already from the late 1950s when the IGY was being executed, but really came to fruition only from 1966, when it was established as an organism, again, of the International Council of Scientific Unions, with the ambition of being a promoter of coordination internationally of data sets, numerical data sets, useful especially in the in chemistry and physics, with a wider understanding of how these fields were serving the industry at the time. In particular, some countries then involved in CODATA were thriving in fields such as atomic energy, thermodynamics, and in these fields, obviously, CODATA was perceived, starting from the 1960s, as potentially coordinating work between various countries. It was established in 1966 in the running in one of the ICSU, what it was at the time, the ICSU General Assembly in Bombay, in India, and since then has been the kind of promoter of that coordination in the context of ICSU up until when, we'll explain later, ICSU continued to be the thriving organization internationally for science diplomacy in general and other diplomacy, more specifically through CODATA. Now, with CODATA, we can see the same kind of asymmetrical issues that existed within the WDC, in the sense then is first president, the US chemist Frederick Rossini, who had been also previously involved in the international critical tables that I mentioned earlier, was clear that only countries actually with capabilities in the setting up of data sets should be considered to be part members of CODATA, which actually means that membership to CODATA was restricted initially only to 5 countries: the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and West Germany, 6 countries, West Germany and Japan. And the number of members of CODATA didn't really rise for a long time. Only 12 national committees were set up by 1970s, 16 by 1976. Again, reproducing, if you want, the question of who actually owns the data, who actually nationally can compile and manage the data, who can make the data available internationally, how this data can be actually internationally put to fruition for the scientific enterprise of various countries, if really there's only a few of these countries that are members of its chief organization. This continued to be a problem for some time, when actually CODATA officers even were clear that ultimately there was no need for CODATA to actually welcome more for instance, small countries undergoing development processes. The first countries invited to join CODATA after the 6 that I mentioned earlier were decided really more with an eye on Cold War symmetrical, balanced integration. So there were invited 3 from the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, and 3 from the Western Bloc, Canada, Italy, and the Netherlands. Brazil, just to make an interesting case, joined only from 1976. India, even later. There was no African countries, there was no Caribbean country in the organization. There was not one of the largest countries at the time, and even today, the People's Republic of China, which was also out of this intergovernmental organization. And this again presents the problem of what is the level of symmetry in this kind of organization, given that the ICSU by 1960 welcomed already 45 either national academies or research councils, each one from each one nation. So why is that? That of these 45, large parts were excluded from this very important data organization. Now, I haven't got the time to recall in detail what happens next. The 1970s is the time when there is probably a bit of a challenge to the system, a realization of its asymmetrical, if you want, trajectory. This comes up, for instance, through the G77 group, a group of countries within the United Nations calling for greater investment in science and technology. For instance, in the context of the famous 1974 UN New International Economic Order resolution, a resolution that some of these countries developing at the time called for, calling for providing a solid potential, quote, providing a solid potential for improving the well-being of all people through obviously investing more in science and technology, which actually meant to redistribute the benefits of technological progress more than had been done that far, and share more equitably by all members of the international community the benefits to be derived from science and technology. These actually led to very important frictions, tensions, especially within, for instance, the United Nations that at the time was busy with an important data project called the International Scientific Information System, or UNISYST. Within UNISYST, the G77 country again came up very strongly when the system was being organized, claiming that actually there was something wrong with the system and UNISYST and the participation of CODATA within it, given that UNESCO at this point, UNESCO sponsoring the UNISYST project, was assigning priorities, quotes, to the needs of developing countries, did not assign priorities to the needs of developing countries, and conversely, substantial long-term assistance program should be undertaken to help them in developing their manpower and infrastructure. Infrastructure that ultimately takes us back to the key problem, data. Data were not available as an infrastructural resource that actually builds the scientific enterprise to these countries enough. Now, much changes in the 1980s and 1990s. I haven't got the time to reconstruct these changes. It's a time of change when there is an attempt, especially from CODATA, to actually address some of these asymmetries in global data governance, in particular recognizing the data imbalances that have been created in previous years. But it's also a time of change in the sense that this is the time when national government structures start to lose power, influence internationally, handing over some of this power, for instance, to transnational corporations. Some of these transnational corporations also taking control of some of the data sets previously available within national or government facilities, something that was alarmingly stated, for instance, in a US National Academy of Science review called Bits of Power, Issues in Global Access of Scientific Data, showing how, quote, some governments have sold some products and services associated with data on a commercial basis, including the generation and distribution of scientific data. Now, while CODATA and other organizations wanted to actually make data diplomacy more inclusive, the run against the tide of the activity of transnational corporations purchasing this data and recreating monopolies with it. As a consequence of that, there's also an important period of financial instability for much of the organizations that I mentioned, the WDC panel, the Federation of Astronomical and Geophysical Services, CODATA. And because of this financial instability, actually some of the campaigns that CODATA launched at this point in time, some pointing also at the need of introducing systems of open access, actually could not be realized in the way that CODATA managers at this point wanted. There are actually elements that can be seen as more positive in terms of inclusivity. The fact that obviously much of the data infrastructure was now made available on, for instance, a platform that were electronic, and therefore making it possible to transfer more easily without actually moving the researchers to the places, but rather making it possible for the researchers to access them either via internet or through other electronic means. China, for instance, is at this point in time actually integrated in the WDC system, also becoming one of the leading countries in the system through the creation of an additional set of world data centers, the World Data Centers D. So in a sense, we have over the 1980s and 1990s comprehensive changes, some actually going in the direction of increasing the inclusivity of data governance globally, and others actually, though, excluding some of these countries, more pushing them at the periphery. What is interesting is that over the years, we've not just been charting these asymmetries in terms of the actual historical reconstruction of their origins, but actually mapping them quantitatively in graph descriptions, showing, for instance, how the ties that exist between countries and world data centers are actually really dense in some points, in some world regions, the United States, for instance, Europe, but actually far sparser in other countries, and clearly giving a visual imagery so clear of the narrative that I've just been presenting to you today, the narrative that shows fundamentally how over the years the distance that exists in possibility of accessing data sets and use it in the scientific enterprise has been growing between scientifically developed countries and countries that are either developing scientifically or that are underdeveloped. Now, I think that what new world data adds to the analysis is obviously not just a visual evidence of this asymmetry, but historical evidence of the ascendancy of these asymmetries in modern science. What I've discussed in this presentation is fundamentally the evolution of a system of data governance which was born uneven and evolved through different unevenness configurations that further extended the imbalances that existed in the distribution in data sets. Indeed, one could even think of the origins of this data governance as dating back to imperial times. I've showed you how at the time of decline of the empire, the first bureaus devoted to datasets were put together by the imperial powers, though not every, obviously, country in the world. I've showed you how these asymmetries existed in the Cold War context, in particular between countries which actually had membership or data centers and countries that either were not members of data organizations or were excluded from having data centers. How more recent changes in the 1980s and 90s have, to an extent, attempted to reduce this distance that exists between data-rich countries and data-poor countries, however, with results that one could describe as less than optimal. So, in a sense, what this historical narrative shows is a situation where we want ultimately think not just of the asymmetries ingrained in modern science, which in itself is already, I think, something that is quite innovative. We've always been thinking of the scientific realm as a realm where every scientist partake of the scientific enterprise on a basis of, in a sense, having the same means, the same infrastructures. So I think adding this story about data is a way to actually complicate the picture and, in a sense, produce a novel narrative on the modern sciences that is different, but is also a way, in a sense, to talk about the sciences today and the policy instruments that would be needed, in a sense, to transform the sciences and make it more pluralistic, make more inclusive, making it also, in a sense, able to use science for development, pretty much in line with what it was, for instance, the claim that G77 groups countries made back in the 1970s and continued to make throughout the 1980s and the 90s. I probably should end this here with something that is quite remarkable. It is interesting how scientists, either in the distant past or more recently, continue to see science as fundamentally internationally. Now, there's a quote attributed to Marie Curie, which I think is intriguing, although I couldn't ascertain fully how much actually she said what she's being quoted to have said, namely that after all, science is essentially international, and it is only through lack of a historical sense that national qualities have been attributed to it. I think actually the history of global data diplomacy suggests that while the effort to make science international is obviously a commendable aspirations, we are a long way away from disentangling national interests and ambitions from, in a sense, what are instead aspirations of making science more international and collaborative. And data shows that. I'll finish here.
Isa, the sound, Isa.
Oi. Olá.
Thank you very much, Professor Simone. It was a very interesting lecture. I think Isabella can begin with the questions, and after I have a question too, if it's possible.
Okay, could happen. Professor Simone, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed hearing from you some things that I have already been touched by your paper, so it's interesting to be here exchanging about it. Okay, I would like to start thinking a little about this supposedly technical capabilities that would be necessary for a country to be part of these organizations such as CODATA and etc. What really brought my attention to this tension is that Soviet Union was part of this organization, if I quite understood it well, but Latin American and African countries not so So if you could talk more to us about these things, why sensitive data sets are more likely to be shared with Soviet Union in a Cold War regime and Latin American don't? I know there's lots of technical arguments about it, but if you should bring to us a little of technical and non-technical things that are bounded in this relation regarding Latin American, maybe if you want to, or Africa as well, no problem. That's my question. Thank you.
So, I mean, first of all, let's be clear that these are negotiations and diplomatic dealings that take place in a space that is not technically of sensitive data. It's removed from sensitive data as such. There are areas at the borderline where decisions are made locally about what can be shared and what not. The WDCs, for instance, end up having data that ultimately can be used in defense research. Then decisions there are made, especially by the United States and the Soviet Union, to actually claim that they are sharing while they are essentially not sharing. It's a different story. For instance, Elena Aronova is a story that she I think covers extremely well. I'm trying to make a different story. I'm trying to write a different story here. I'm trying not to look specifically at data that have sensitive applications, but data that have industrial use, data that are bound to be connected, for instance, to analysis of economic development. And there we see something intriguing happening in the sense that these data certainly are being produced because these countries have capabilities in those areas that other countries don't. The example is obviously atomic energy. By the late 1960s, when CODATA is established, both the Americans and the Soviets have developed, for instance, studies on the thermodynamics of materials utilized in the atomic energy that they want to share because they are leading, both leading. But the question is, this emphasis on coordinating their efforts while overlooking, disregarding, downplaying other sets of data that, for instance, could help other countries, is in itself already an element of exclusion. So certainly it's very easy to say we are the leading nations in these data compilations. But this is because the data sets being explored as exactly the data sets that help only those countries. So in that respect, this is, I think, what is an element of asymmetry that at no time in the setting up of CODATA, despite the organization was serving ultimately what it was, a large organization comprising other countries, the point of what other data could be produced that could serve the priorities and ambitions of other countries was not put in the agenda. So that's the element that I think is important. Now, I have to say, however, that this is the historical legacy of CODATA as an organization, but CODATA itself has been changing and over the years becoming very aware of these asymmetries and this principle. For instance, organizing starting from 2000, for instance, meeting in Senegal, in Africa, trying to figure out how data sets could be made available to growing African research communities and serving these communities rather than, for instance, serving only the communities of leading countries. In that respect, it is important to emphasize also the change occurring over time rather than, obviously placing, in a sense, this historical legacy in its own context.
Thanks, Professor. So, Anna, you go.
Yes. There is an idea in your article, and of course, it is in your presentation too, that is very important to me as a professor of contemporary history. It is about the imperialism of knowledge. So in Brazil, we have a problem today because we do not fully know the resources of our soil. And we are going to make agreements with other countries to study the soil and find the so-called rare earth elements. I think you know.
Yeah,
you understand.
yeah.
Okay. So this week, the USA, as a government, not as a government, entered into the exploration of a territory with rare earth elements in Brazil. We are talking about exploring, knowing, collecting data. Will the data stay here? We don't know. Yeah, we don't know. And that's why I think that imperialism takes on different forms, contexts, but it is strong, always strong. But some authors think that China seems to be inventing a new type of imperialism, as like China divides the governance of the territories where it participates in the exploitation of resources. Do you agree? China is different because you are making agreement with USA, and part of the government of Brazil think it's better with China, but we don't know if it's better because imperialism of knowledge is imperialism of knowledge. It doesn't matter if it's USA or China. I want to hear you about this problem.
So, I mean, yes, you can call it imperialism of knowledge. I've read a lot, for instance, about data colonialism, which is the word that I would use as well. The idea that ultimately data can play a role in neo-colonial efforts, pretty much in the way that you just described. The knowledge of certain territories can obviously be a vehicle, a device to allow the exploitation of those territories, and exactly exploiting the fact that that knowledge is available to some countries, but it's not available to others. So there is certainly that kind of tension is there, has been actually mapped quite well in the literature, not as much in the scientific field proper, scientific research proper, but more in areas such as, for instance, mining, exploration, the availability of resources, dating back. It's also, again, it's a history with an historical legacy, especially, for instance, in the law of the sea mining regulations, which have been the first, if you want, moment where there was this huge tension between developing countries and developed countries regarding exactly the knowledge that allows the exploration and the exploitation, in the understanding that sometimes, again, developed countries would say, oh, no, yeah, but all the data are open. Yes, they are, but the means to exploit the data are available only to some countries. So recreating, in a sense, situations of asymmetry in one way or another. In all of this has been changing historically. Clearly, the actors, the organizations have been changing. It is inevitable to think that China today plays a prominent role. I think it is difficult really to say at the moment what are the directions of the tensions that the introduction of the People's Republic of China in the realm of the leading scientific countries entail. I don't think there's clear answers. We've seen China playing roles, for instance, on the one hand, in collaborations with the United States, but also with global South countries in all sorts of ways. clearly, yes, is the fear that some of these collaborations could be exploitative? Yes, of course. But I don't think we have the full pictures. Some have been, for instance, portraying this kind of interactions as global south interactions. I mean, I'm not either. I mean, I need to stress that I'm not siding with one side of the argument or the other. I think we are in a period of change where we need really to better understand what are the directions and where these directions are taking us in terms of either addressing some of these asymmetries in one way or the other, creating, for instance, new and different asymmetries in the presence of different coordinating bodies and different national organizations.
Thank you. It's difficult to think. It's difficult to think when the situation is.
I mean, for instance, I mean, I'm not trying to be. I try to avoid your question.
No. I understand. Of course not.
As in, for instance, I mean, our science-metric study showed us something very, very, very prominent in terms of the accumulation of data centers in Europe and the United States across time and up until now. We haven't been able to trace, for instance, the People's Republics of China in that dynamics enough, which probably is, how to say, a shortcoming of our research exercise more than anything else. But again, it's evidence that I can't tell you more on this, on the basis of what we found out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That just came to us, a question from the audience to Charlie. And him said, I think very interesting how phonetically word data could remember to New World Order. And the person said, for instance, there's talking about the 2030 deadline. I don't understand why 2030 deadline, but if you could explain the title, because it suggests lots of food of thought for your audience.
I mean, it's obviously, I mean, many of these titles, I mean, the titles is a title that makes sense. The title is Negotiating World Data, a Science Diplomacy Exercise. The acronym is instead just, a shorthand term that normally is being used for administrative purposes. In designing it, we just thought that, yes, maybe data have ushered in a new world in the sense of creating the circumstances. Yes, I mean, I would agree with the person who put the question forward. For creating a new world order, yes, I mean, there is definitely a contribution there. I don't think we can say more because obviously it is then a question of what space science and technology occupies in international affairs, and is a much debated issue that obviously has to do with a lot more than just science and technology. But I mean, if you look at science and technology, there is probably the understanding that the coordination and the data governance that exists at the international level help to usher in that new world order, at least in the realm of science and technology.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Professor. Another question that came to us from the audience was about the resistance processes in those process of concentration of data in some point and etc. I would like to add to that question a thing that I thought reading your text, just like about organizations like G77, that organization that gathered Africa, Latin American, Asian countries to fight for more space in those databases. So I would like to hear from you a little about those resistance processes. What happened? They really achieved some things, even if that wasn't big transformation in those word data orders, but a little about the resistances and some things that those ones achieved or not.
So, I mean, this is obviously, it's a history with an important past. I mean, you can go back, for instance, to the Asian African Conference in Bandung, where in 1955, for the first time, you start to see coalitions taking shape of countries that were emerging from the post-colonial period and start to acquire independence and attempting to, through that independence, also to set in mechanism of mutual coordination as well as mutual assistance. Interesting then also politically to kind of move into a realm of non-alignment, of trying fundamentally to take distance from both blocs. There's obviously plenty of literature showing how that kind of resistance and perhaps the most radical items in that agenda were defeated. It's a defeat, obviously, that, again, can go back again to China if you want, and China's changing its positions, India's changing positions, Egypt's changing position. But in all of that, obviously, there's also the creation of new ties, new forms of resistance. I think today we see with some interest, for instance, in forms of global South coordination. I mean, many, for instance, been championed in Brazil as well. So that is where I think forms of resistance continue over time. I think from the historical perspective, the story that, yes, the story I think that it intrigues me the most is that most of the countries that then start to develop this resistance consider the United Nations as the forum where this resistance should take place. And in that respect, I mean, there's also obviously this moment of concern, especially in the United States, about the voting mechanism, one country, one vote. Because obviously with more countries becoming independent, it means that there's a majority emerging within the United Nations General Assembly in terms of that can actually subvert what have been traditionally the kind of power relations within the United Nations. What we see in the 1980s that is interesting is this resistance is really defeated by depowering the United Nations, and I think is an ongoing process, to be honest with you. Unfortunately, we see it even today in the ways in which the United Nations and its organizations have been, for instance, sidelined and for instance, depowered, for instance, in areas of conflict. I mean, for me, it's very important to see, because there is where we start to see not only the United Nations losing power internationally, but actually the countries represented within made unable to actually promote that resistance. And there are obviously historical episodes that I think is worth reconstructing. For instance, the United States going against the law of the sea at one point, exiting UNESCO at another point. These are the key moments, because obviously these are the moments where the UN has been essentially loses the power of being an engine of change, and the engine of change where the countries that, again, wanted to express that resistance could operate. I hope I made sense. Probably I'm getting a little bit less clear in my in the kind of things I'm saying. I hope it's clear what I'm trying to say.
No, for me it was totally clear, Professor. Just a little thing that I thought about this lack of power that currently UNESCO is gaining and United Nations as well. That's quite a little to a relation with that neoliberal turn that you described in your text. That for me makes sense in this point, just like.
I'm sorry, only to complete it, because it is difficult to think in United Nations having power to face this kind of concentration of data. And in our moment of, in this time, it's difficult to see United Nations with this power, because there are many governments that, especially USA, that are trying to put United Nations out of any kind of multilateralism, seminars, conversations, negotiations. So I think it's difficult to think United Nations with this kind of power, but it's a little bit pessimism of me, but
no, it's absolutely I mean, obviously, I'm looking at a small world in a larger context. But yes, it's definitely the space where power relations change over time. And because of those changing power relationships, we start to see that resistance being defeated fundamentally, starting from the 1980s, 1990s. Obviously, parts of that is also the fact that more compelling legislation that the United Nations wanted to adopt, for instance, limiting the power of transnational corporations in the context of the new neoliberal regime, was also defeated. So, yeah, I mean, it works at multiple levels, and there's various issues that are intertwined one with the other. But I mean, the general picture is definitely of a time when that resistance was defeated. And I think, even thinking about some of the issues we face today, think about climate change, we see the same kind of conflicts happening and the same kind of power relations, in a sense, influencing.
So I think it was very interesting and important to our Science in Circulation group of studies. And we thank you very much, Professor Simone Turchetti.
Again, thanks to you for inviting. It was a pleasure.
Coming here, and Isabella will be with you in a congress. So I think our conversation will continue very much, and we thank you very much for that. I thank the audience too, and Michelle and Elena, who helped us to organize all of this. So I will talk in Portuguese now, but muito obrigada ao professor Simone Turchetti por ter vindo aqui, foi excelente para o nosso grupo de estudos. A Isabela vai continuar esse debate com ele num congresso em Edimburgo. Então, a gente agradece a plateia, agradece a Helena e ao Michel pela ajuda, e eu vou passar a Isabela para ela fazer o encerramento. Please, Isabella, will finish.
Gather out. So I just want to thank you, Professor Simone. It was really, really interesting. This link in YouTube would be available to our group, and I will spread the word for the ones that are interested. I am really, really glad for having you here, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you all.
Thanks. So now we will start finish our activities. So the conference is over. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.